Well, there we go. Neither hysterical nor sugar-coated, and a valuable public service. Dr. Rogers shelters in place in Northern California with her husband and children. We are incredibly lucky to have her with us today to shed additional light on the pandemic that's impacting us all. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Amy Rogers.
Now we got to get the tech up and running, so let's see what happens when I share screen.
Looking good.
Does it look something like a slideshow? I don't know what you can see, but we're going to go with this. Okay. Very good. Thank you, Kevin, so much for the invitation to be with you all today. This is a lot of fun for me, and I really appreciate the opportunity to continue on my little self-imposed mission of trying to spread calm and clear information about the pandemic to all of us who have so many questions and so many fears about what's going on. The funny thing is that when Kevin talked to me about this a few months ago, we were wondering, what would be my topic, because I give talks on a variety of topics, and we kind of laughed, like we wondered if coronavirus would still be relevant in July. Haha. So here we are. So my real choice was trying to figure out which of the many topics related to the virus that I should address with you guys today. And because there are so many things to talk about, I am going to keep my remarks shorter. I was told about 20 minutes plus 5 for questions. I'm going to shoot for 15 tops to allow for more questions, maybe even 10. So I think questions are the place that we're going to want to go here. For my main focus, though, what I am going to say, I'm going to talk a bit about my area of expertise, immunology and vaccines, partly because Rotary, of course, has a very special connection to vaccination. Your organization, I believe, is responsible for a major role in trying to eradicate polio from this planet. So that's what it's going to be. As you heard, I do have a PhD in immunology. I have taught microbiology. I'm a science writer in journalist style, and also I write science-themed thriller novels, of which I have 3 on the market at this time, and you can learn more at amyrogers.com. So, where are we now? So when this all started, for most of us, that was January, February, maybe most Americans, February. I was actually in Hawaii on vacation in mid-January. Wonderful. I was with my in-laws, had that privilege. And at the time, I was starting to hear reports about a new virus in China. And that was of great interest to me because of my fiction and because of my expertise, and it's just something that I've always been very interested in. So I started following it very closely, and I recall at that time my in-laws were planning a trip to China in April, and while we were sitting there and I was reading daily updates of various things, I said, guys, I don't think that's going to happen. And so of course it's all blossomed from there. So as you're all well aware, we're entering the next phase of the pandemic. I won't call it a second wave because, as has been pointed out, we really never left the first wave, but it's definitely a new phase with a greatly expanding number of cases. So this is an image from the New York Times website showing the number of new cases per day in the United States. The red line shows the average taken over 7 days, which helps to smooth out the irregularities which just come from reporting and whatnot. And as you're all well aware, we left lockdown generally in the range of May. And since that time, the number of new cases has started to expand greatly. We've been setting new daily records on a pretty regular basis for several weeks now. And so there we are, lots of new cases. This did not have to be the way it would play out. We all knew that one thing to keep in mind with the pandemic is that all gains are reversible. So even when you get ahead, like we did during lockdown, when you leave, things can go badly. And of course, the opposite is true. There's always an opportunity for a community to get a handle on the pandemic, by kind of starting over and trying again. But things did start to expand in the United States after we left lockdown, but it did not have to be that way. This figure shows the difference between the number of new cases per day on a 7-day rolling average between the United States and the European Union. The European Union has over 400 million citizens. The United States has about 330, 340 million. So despite their larger population, you can see that there's a huge difference in what's happening with the pandemic in Europe as compared to the United States at this time. This is the main reason why when Europe decided recently to start reopening their borders to travelers from other countries, the United States, citizens of people coming from the United States were left off the list of those allowed to enter the country because the pandemic is clearly far more out of control here than it is in Europe. We can talk a lot more if someone's interested in asking about why the difference between the US and the European Union. The very short answer is that because they got their cases down to a much lower level, as you can see we started out about the same in April, but by May, the United States still was generating a lot of new cases, but in Europe, they got the numbers down a lot lower, partly because they maybe were in lockdown longer. I think a lot because they were much more severe about their restrictions during lockdown than we were. So variety of reasons. Anyway, because they got their cases down to a much more manageable number, they've been able to use contact testing and contact tracing with isolation in order to relieve some of their restrictions without seeing an increase in cases. In the United States, for a variety of reasons, we've not been able to keep up with that kind of contact tracing, and so we're off to the races, as you can see. Some people have argued that those graphs I just showed you of the increasing number of coronavirus positive tests does not reflect a real increase in the number of cases that are happening. They're saying that it's actually just because we're testing more, and we have good evidence that that is not the case. Yes, we are testing more. So the more you test, the more positive results you're going to have. But those positive results reflect a real increase in the number of people with the virus, as reflected by the, I got ahead of myself, wrong graph. I'll come back to that. As reflected by the number of positive tests as a percent of the total tests given. So this is a graph showing of all the coronavirus tests that were given in a particular region of the United States, what percentage of those tests are coming back as positive. And as you can see, starting in June, those numbers have started to increase. What that means is that it's not just more tests, it's actually more cases. Because you can imagine if the number of cases was staying about the same, but you were testing more, if you were testing more and detecting more of them, the percentage of positives would either stay about the same or it could even go down because you'd be catching a lot more of the negatives as well. But because the percent positive is increasing, we know that the cases are increasing as well. Another piece of evidence that the number of cases really is increasing is here on this slide, which shows hospitalization rates. So number of hospitalizations for COVID-19 per 100,000 residents in various regions of the United States. Personally, I think this is the most important metric that we need to pay attention to. I think it's the one thing that everybody of all stripes can sort of agree on about this pandemic, that we don't want to have a New York in our neighborhood, that we want the hospitals to remain functional, that we want people who do have COVID to get the best care possible, and we want everybody who doesn't have COVID but needs health care to be able to get it. So as you can see, along with the increasing numbers of cases, we are seeing increasing rate of hospitalization in those same regions. An important thing to recognize about hospitalizations is there's a tremendous lag between the time of getting the virus and the time that you're going to see a wave of hospitalizations. It's days or weeks, and then you're going to see a further lag between hospitalizations and deaths. I'm going to backtrack because I did want to make a point here on this slide. This breaks down the number of new cases at the rate of new cases per 100,000 residents, broken down by regions of the country. And the point I wanted to make here is that the pandemic is a regional thing on a global scale and also within the United States, we're seeing huge regional variation in what's happening with the pandemic. And then even within regions, you know, from state to state and within states, in the state of California, we clearly have, there's a huge difference between what's happening in Los Angeles County and what's happening in some of the more rural counties up in the North State. So there's definitely, you know, a need for different types of effort and different types of restrictions in different parts of the country and state at various times. So obviously, as I'm sure you've all heard, the pandemic is exploding right now in the American West and in the South, whereas the Northeast had their terrible times a few months ago. Final piece of data just of where we are is looking at deaths per day from COVID-19. And as you can see, those deaths peaked back in mid-April and have declined a lot since then. We are seeing an uptick in the number of deaths starting this month, and we'll see where that goes. Here's another image of the deaths from COVID. This is per 100,000 residents. It's a rate broken down by region, and as you can, as you know, so we all knew what was happening in the Northeast. It got really, really, really bad in late April, and the death rates have collapsed since then. And I'd be happy to take a question later if somebody wants to talk about what's going on. Why are the death rates so low if the number of cases is increasing? But I want to jump right into, because I'm already at 10 minutes, so I'm going to jump right into something about vaccination and immunity. So one of the big questions that's floating around right now that a lot of people are thinking about is, are you immune after infection? I'm going to turn off, let me stop that and just, so I want to see if somebody's saying something. Ah, yes, comments. I hadn't been able to see those.
So Amy, this is Kevin. The first question was, what is the definition of a case?
A case, I believe in the figures that I'm showing, a case is a person who has had a positive test with the RT-PCR test for viral RNA.
And then the next question is, percentage of elderly versus younger population, with the follow-up question, is weather a factor?
Right. Turns out weather has not been a factor. There was some expectation or hope that the virus would disappear in the summer in the way that influenza does. That has not panned out. We can just see that from the reality. And that's actually not hugely surprising. Maybe in future years, there may be a seasonality to this virus, because as I'm going to mention, I think we're going to have this virus with us forever. And it may become flu-like with seasons, because it is very sensitive to sunlight and heat. But that effect is small relative to the fact that we have an entire immunologically naive planet, which just creates, it's made it to be a little, I like to use a forest fire analogy for things related to a pandemic. If a pandemic is like a fire raging through a forest, if you've got a whole bunch of dense trees that are all really dry, the fact that the humidity is a little higher that day isn't going to help you a whole lot. But you know, the humidity is a factor, and it's a little bit of the same with these viruses and the summertime. So okay, let me roll into some things about. So the question of, are you immune after getting the infection? Normally, when you get an infection, your immune system adapts and learns from that exposure. And then the next time, if you're ever exposed to that particular microorganism again, your body's, the immune system either makes antibodies or other adaptive things more quickly and more effectively because they've been previously trained by exposure to that thing before. However, that isn't always the case, and there's a spectrum. Like some things you get it once and you never get it again, and other things like influenza or the common cold, you can get multiple times, but maybe not as severely as you did previously. So we really don't know with the new coronavirus. The pattern with other coronaviruses is not terribly encouraging. There are 4 what's called endemic coronaviruses of humans at this time. It means they're coronaviruses that they're just there all the time. They're just circulating. They cause something like a common cold. And there doesn't seem to be a lot of long-term immunity to them. So what about this one? So the first piece of evidence that's kind of coming out now is I'm seeing a number of anecdotal reports of reinfection. Now, the first ones that I saw came out of China, and I didn't believe them. I thought they were just getting people who had continued to carry the virus and were, so they basically were people who were sick, who tested positive, then they either got better or they tested negative for a while, and then they later got sick and tested positive again. That could be because there's a variety of reasons why that could be. One possible reason is that they actually recovered, cleared the virus, and then were reinfected. There are now anecdotal reports like that coming from from the Northeast. So we'll see. But I'd say it is definitely possible that you can get this virus twice. The question is, does some of your exposure the first time protect you from getting severe disease the next time? And that is what we'll be hoping for. Another thing about that is that there's been a lot of interest in antibodies, right? Do you make antibodies? Can we detect them with a test? How long do they last? What are they good for? First thing main point I want to make is that early in the pandemic, there was a lot of concern about immunity passports. There was a lot of like civil liberties conversation about the significance of that. It ain't going to happen. So if you were worried about immunity passports, not going to happen, because a lot of people who have been infected do not generate a real strong measurable antibody response. People who do generate an antibody response, we're seeing that it probably wanes in weeks to months. So you might have had COVID in February, but it doesn't mean that you're going to have any detectable antibodies in August. So that kind of negates the point of an immunity passport. On the optimistic side, though, just because antibodies may not be a lingering part of the immune response, there's a whole nother branch to the adaptive immune system called T cells. So T cells also learn and have memory in the immune system, and their job is to directly take out virus-infected cells. So they're very effective at dealing with viruses, and they may be a major part of what allows people to clear the infection, but they're not going to be detected by any of the antibody tests. The one problem with T cells is that they do not create what's called sterilizing immunity. So that leads me into herd immunity. So a couple of terms here. So the dream is that we could get rid of having to worry about this virus by having herd immunity. And that means that there's enough people who are resistant to the virus that they don't spread it around. And the image of a fire break in a forest is a very good one. If every tree represents a person who could be infected by the virus, if you can tear out enough of the trees in the forest to thin it, because those trees are, because those people are immune, then the virus is going to have a harder time jumping from tree to tree. It's going to have bigger gaps. So herd immunity is the goal, is the idea that somewhere between 60 and 80% of people are immune to the infection, then it no longer is able to catch the people who are still sensitive. And you can get to herd immunity either by natural infection or by vaccination. The beauty of so getting back to this idea of sterilizing immunity, so you can have a person who's immune to an infection and doesn't get sick from it, but they still carry it, or they get mildly sick. Or you can have an immunity that's sterilizing immunity, like we have for measles. If you are immune to measles, you will not catch it, you will not spread it, you will not carry it. So we're kind of looking at an expectation, probably with this virus, that there will probably not be sterilizing immunity. That it's quite possible that a vaccine will protect people from dying, but it may not prevent them from being carriers or having some sort of mild cold as a result of their exposure. I'll look at the questions in one second. I am going through this at warp speed, so I will mention vaccine development. So some issues with vaccine development for this virus is that since it does look like the antibody response is not super strong or super long lasting from a natural infection, that means that our vaccines are going to have to be tweaked or possibly with boosters to make them stronger than a natural infection. And that is possible, and that's something that they're working on. The shortest time it's ever taken to develop a vaccine before is a little over 4 years, and that was for a mumps vaccine. So 4 years is the record, the world record. We're now shooting for 1 to 1.5 years. So this is a big difference. And that's the reason why there's a lot of concern about how long this really is going to take. The main technique that's being used to accelerate the process, other than the fact that we have a lot of new technologies and things, is they're overlapping what used to be sequential steps of the vaccine development process. It's a slow and expensive process, and so you don't want to invest a lot of money, for example, in building the factory to make a particular kind of vaccine until you know for sure that's the vaccine you want to make. With Operation Warp Speed, they're overlapping these things regardless of cost. So even if this approach is going to fail, we're going to be ready in case it does. And that can shave a whole bunch of time off the timeline, although it comes at a great financial cost for the risk. My prediction is that there will be a vaccine. There will probably be multiple vaccines within a year. The question isn't whether they exist. The question is, how good are they? And who do they work for? And how big are the side effects? So a vaccine can be modestly effective and still very useful. Influenza vaccines, the annual influenza vaccine is kind of an example of that. And I think we may have a vaccine come out here that doesn't work really great, but it may be enough to get us somewhere. And we're probably going to have different vaccines for different groups. Elderly people's immune systems function very differently from young people's. They usually need a different vaccine or that vaccine formulation. So we'll have to see where that goes. The last thing I want to say about the vaccine is, oh yes, and also because you're going to be giving this vaccine potentially to billions of people, it has to be really, really, really safe. The bar is so much higher for a vaccine than it is for a therapy, because you give a therapy or a treatment only to people who are sick, so there's not that many of them, and the risk benefit is different. But if you're giving this to billions of people who are not sick, it needs to be incredibly safe. And so that's another challenge for developing a vaccine, especially in a short period of time. All right, yes, go ahead.
Ready for some questions?
Yeah.
All right, there's a whole bunch of them in the chat. So fire away.
Let me just jump in here for a couple of things. Okay, so I see someone asking about testing in Sacramento. That's become a very bad situation. If you just want to be tested because you think you've been exposed or you're just curious, I think right now you cannot. They've closed down a couple of, it's hard to get an appointment. For a while you could go to Cal Expo, you could go to CVS, and you could just get tested, but they started to run out. So I know as of a few days ago, CVS was not doing it anymore. They had closed down a couple of the community centers, and it's a problem. So basically if you really need it because you've been exposed, I would contact your primary care physician because they'll have the best chance of being able to get you tested. But just wandering around the community and trying to get one is the way it should be, because that's how we get a handle on the contagion, is people need to know that they're carrying it so they don't, because this definitely does spread asymptomatically. That's a really key point that if anybody's not clear on, you can have no symptoms at all and be infectious. You will probably get symptoms eventually, but not everybody does even that. So something about testing.
One was about what it's going to take to reopen the economy again. Kelly Moran weighed in with the belief that we moved a little too fast to reopening. So I think the question speaks to the tension between public health prevention and operating an open economy.
It does indeed. And what's panning out though is that the economy is crippled by the fact that the pandemic is still raging. We're seeing that big difference now between the US and Europe. Europeans are able to go out and about and have gatherings to some extent. I mean, they're obviously still engaged in social distancing and other non-pharmaceutical interventions. The main issue really is getting the numbers down so that you can track and trace. So how to best summarize this? What we're doing right now is we're relying on individuals to just sort of kind of keep their distance from each other, and maybe you've been exposed, or maybe you've been tested positive, and then you isolate. What we really need to do is we need to find, for every person who's newly diagnosed with a positive test, We need to be able to find everyone that they've had meaningful contact with and warn them. And then also test them so that they can then isolate. That's how you know, with the forest fire analogy, that's how you take an ember, which would be a person with a new infection, and prevent it from becoming a whole new blaze. Is you have to get all of the stuff, material around them, and stop that from starting to be a bigger fire. It's a huge conversation though about values and all this. But the short answer to the question is, how do you get the economy running again? Is you have to get a grip on the cases. You can't have the cases expanding willy-nilly, because then people are afraid, they're not going out, and because we can't have gatherings, it makes it very hard. I know there's a question in here about the schools. I mean, these are enormous questions. I don't know how long you want me to go. I can go for hours if you want. I think one of the main complications that we're running into now with the schools, I think everybody agrees that schools should be a major priority. For reopening schools should be a major priority for us. But with the pandemic number of cases exploding, I mean, it really is basically out of control in a lot of communities. That creates a huge challenge for the schools, because the number 1, 2, 3, like the top 10 things you can do to make schools safe to reopen for everyone is control the pandemic outside of the school. It's all stuff outside of the school. There's very limited things that the schools can do because of by its very nature. You've got groups of people. Now on the school topic, the good news is that children, just as a blanket statement, kids don't die of COVID, okay? There have been 30 children under the age of 15 have died of COVID in the United States. Out of 130,000 deaths, there have been 30 people under the age of 15. So they're at exceedingly low risk of dying of COVID. So, in shorthand, I like to say, as far as the schools go, it's not about the kids. The kids are fine. It's about the staff. And how can we, and the families of the kids back home, because if the kid goes to school, picks it up, brings it home to grandma, these are the issues with the schools. And I don't have the answers on it, but those are some of the main framing issues.
Amy, with so many questions, we're going to go another 5 minutes,
Okay.
Which won't be enough to get everybody's questions, but you can put a dent in it, I'm sure.
Yes. Any truth to the notion that coronavirus came through California last winter? They keep pushing back the timeline, actually, of when they're finding when the virus had appeared in various places. Now they're saying there were probably cases in China in November, and they're looking at sewage, wastewater, and finding viral RNA. I think they found some in Italy in December, and I don't know how far back they found evidence here in California. It is entirely possible that there was virus here in December. But, it obviously was in very small numbers. There's some question of whether the virus has changed over time. There is a one variant of the virus, one strain has become dominant. It appears to be more contagious than the original strain. Doesn't necessarily appear to be more dangerous, though, in terms of disease. So I think it's unlikely that there was a variant in the United States that was just really benign and therefore silent. I think it probably wasn't here. But it could have been, it could have arrived here in December, if possible. How do I compare this virus to the Spanish flu pandemic of 1918? The Spanish flu was deadlier. I don't think that's because the virus itself was inherently deadlier. The thing you have to understand about mortality rates is they're not a fixed constant. Our healthcare system now is so much better. There's no comparison to the way we can take care of people in a modern hospital with what they had in 1918. So it's fully to be expected that a lot more people would have died of the Spanish flu than are going to die of the new coronavirus. Having said that, though, there are an awful lot of parallels. I mean, it's a highly infectious respiratory virus. Spanish flu, basically, it went everywhere on the planet. It took a lot longer because they didn't have airplanes, but it did eventually get pretty much everywhere. So I think in some ways, we're going to see a similar pattern. We're going to have this virus that's going to dominate things for a period of time, and then it's going to sort of fade away in a way. Because what's going to happen, this thing is not going to disappear suddenly. The vaccine is not going to suddenly appear and like, now we have a vaccine, everything's better. It's going to be messy, it's going to be slow. And the thing is that populations evolve in terms of their relationship with microorganisms. So viruses in particular can evolve very quickly. And they adapt to their host, and the host adapts to the virus. A successful virus is a virus that is very infectious, very quiet, doesn't kill the host, because the virus's job is to reproduce. An unsuccessful virus is one that kills very quickly. That's a bad virus. It's bad for the virus because it kills the host and then it doesn't get to go anywhere. So what you see is over time, as a population of people gets exposed to a virus, they get immunized against it. They're no longer so sensitive. The most sensitive individuals die. The virus itself becomes often less dangerous. And so you just sort of have this gradual adaptation over time, and we're going to eventually probably have this be the 5th endemic coronavirus, and it'll just always be there. And some people will get really sick, but the majority of people will not. And that's true of the other coronaviruses as well.
Amy, this is Kevin again. One last question, which I hate to do because we're running out of time. This is sort of a reframe of a question that Steve Heath posed in posting a bunch of statistics about our county. What's the single most important number for us to pay attention to?
Hospitalizations. That is my opinion. Hospitalization, because people have a lot of disagreements about their values, about what's more important, what's less important. But again, I think the one thing that everybody agrees on is that we cannot let our hospitals get swamped. So what I watched, Sacramento County Public Health does post very beautiful graphics, very nice updated Monday, Wednesday, and Friday of the number of COVID patients in Sacramento County hospitals and the number of those patients who are in the ICU. And that number tells us how we're doing. And just keeping in mind the lag time between when the hospitalization occurs means that that's the result of actions that we took 2 to 4 weeks ago. So got to look ahead.
Good deal. Well, Amy, thank you. There are several questions that are not yet answered. We can get those to you if you want to, on the side,
I'm happy to talk to, I don't know how the technology can work, but I'm happy to either talk verbally or in typing with anyone who would like to contact me. So yeah, you can visit actually, and you can go to amyrogers.com, sign up for my newsletter, check out my books, and you can find my email there, and you can shoot me an email, and I'd be happy if any of you have any other places you'd like me to talk, answer questions. I am available.
Deal. Hey, everybody, please join me in giving a big hand to our special guest today, Dr. Amy Rogers, for a